Dr. Zupel, and I'd like to give a little bit of a story. So I spent almost a year volunteering at COF Animal Shelter when I learned something quite startling. A large number of shelter workers knew little to nothing about animal health or medicine. One worker in particular caught my attention. He casually mentioned to me that he knew nothing about animals before starting his job at COF. He just needed a job. They gave me this test, he said, and I guessed on almost everything, but I guess I did okay because they hired me. So when I got a chance, I brought this up to the shelter veterinarian because I was a little concerned. Is this pretty common in shelter medicine? And he said, oh, that's nothing. We just fired a guy because instead of actually giving impounded dogs their vaccine, he would just record that he did and throw away the full vaccine bottles. I found the bottles in the trash myself. I guess he didn't know rabies was so important. Animal shelters are important because of their potential to affect public health. They take abandoned, lost, sick, and otherwise dangerous animals off the streets. But shelter jobs are considered by most to be a last resort. Those that take the job either can't find work elsewhere or perhaps love animals but don't have the education or skills necessary to pursue other careers. So how do we reconcile this huge responsibility placed on animal shelters with the limited resources and often inadequate personnel that's available to them? It is my opinion that increasing veterinarian involvement in animal shelters would improve the overall function of the facilities. Here's why. First, increased veterinary supervision will improve disease control. Second, veterinary participation will improve employee satisfaction and reduce other employee stress. Thirdly, veterinary supervision will increase public safety in the area of zoonotic diseases. Veterinary supervision can improve disease control, especially in the area of epidemics and outbreaks of disease. Animal shelters have quite a history and a reputation for having outbreaks of disease. You get people who say, oh, every animal that comes from a shelter has caught something. And in most cases, that is true. And I think a large portion of this is the inadequate training given to shelter employees. The Bureau of Labor Statistics writes that the most significant level of post-secondary education in animal shelter workers is moderate on-job training. Dr. Stenner Roden, who performed multiple studies of animal shelter workers in 2010 and 2011, reports that only 30% of animal shelters are performing infectious disease training at the time of hire. And what this means is that there's shelter employees wandering around the shelter, touching things, touching animals, and touching everything else, and potentially spreading disease, and they don't even know what the clinical signs are. They don't know how the disease is spread. They could be spreading it all over the place. Veterinarians currently are in charge of infection control in a very, very small number of animal shelters. Dr. Stenner Roden reports that it's only 6%. In 42% of shelters, a shelter director or a manager is in charge of this responsibility. Now what this means is a shelter manager or director is most often also in charge of human resources and other paperwork-related responsibilities. So they don't have completely medical eyes put on the area of disease control. Dr. Stenner Roden writes, in the author's opinion, veterinarians, by virtue of their medical training, knowledge, and clinical signs of diseases, knowledge of infection transmission and infection prevention, are best suited to direct infection control activities in animal shelters. Because they have the eyes for infection and they would be focusing on only the medical aspect of it, they can greatly decrease the number of outbreaks in animal shelters. Secondly, veterinary supervision will improve employee satisfaction and reduce stress. Shelter employees are often expected to perform euthanasia, a process that ends a life and that can be emotionally and psychologically damaging to the shelter employees. A study conducted by Dr. Rogelberg regarding the euthanasia practices of 36 U.S. animal shelters found that euthanasia practices were often related to increased employee turnover. He writes that making decisions regarding euthanasia of animals on the basis of factors other than behavior and health reasons was related to increased personnel turnover. While this can be a very difficult decision for anyone to make, veterinarians are better trained and better suited for the emotional stress of this kind of ordeal. Also, with increased personnel turnover, we increase the number of people that are moving through shelters and potentially spreading disease, like I told you, because none of them are getting the proper training. So veterinarians, by taking this responsibility off the less trained shelter employees, will make their jobs less stressful and also make things run more smoothly. Thirdly, increased veterinary supervision in animal shelters will increase public safety, especially in the area of zoonotic diseases. And this is an area of disease that can be transmitted between people and animals, and you can see why this would be very important to public health. Some examples of zoonotic diseases are rabies, plague, leptospirosis, MRSA bacteria, which is a methicillin-resistant, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and things like salmonella. Dr. Stenerode, in another study, reported that the lowest levels of knowledge were found in leptospirosis, MRSA bacteria, plague, and rabies, which she characterizes as emerging diseases with increasing prevalence and high consequence. These are diseases that should be very important to the public and that can cause long-term damage if they're not managed correctly. So what she points out is that the shelter employees aren't getting the training they need, but veterinarians are better able to control these diseases and know how to handle them. So if they are managing the shelter employees, they can reduce the occurrence of these diseases and reduce the spread of the diseases both to the employees and to the public. As you can see, the main issue is the knowledge gap between the shelter employees and the job they're expected to do. Veterinarians can help close the knowledge gap and are uniquely suited to a position in participating in employee training, performing the necessary medical tasks of shelter work such as euthanasias, and improving disease control, which overall would increase the function of animal shelters and protect the public.
That was 5 minutes and 56 seconds.
Couldn't get that extra 4 seconds in, huh? I was making a joke.
Do we get points knocked off when we go overtime?
Depends on how far overtime you go. So far, I haven't had to do that. But when we get to that 8.5 minute speech, then maybe I'll take that into consideration. All right, I like the personal experience to get our attention, and you do clearly state what the proposition is. Secondary issues are laid out very effectively, and I do think you're making inferences on those points. Internally, you do a good job signposting. I think we could use a little bit more information on the controversy. There's no doubt that people who are medically prepared are going to be able to make better decisions when it comes to the medical issues. I'm just not quite as clear that some of the issues that are being faced by the shelters are in fact medical issues as opposed to administrative issues. For example, the euthanasia process, which, the decision about euthanizing an animal in shelters probably got to come down to some administrative procedure about the amount of time that they're there, or if there's a medical decision, for instance, the medical decision, you need to show me that the medical decisions to put an animal down are not being made by vets, but they are in fact being made by the administrative personnel. That seems to be an assumption rather than something that's demonstrated here. I thought that you had some good study information talking about the problems with people being underprepared in working in this particular field. And you've got a dramatic example that you use in your opening to suggest that, in fact, that there could be potential problems. It does remain largely at the level of potential problems, though, because you mentioned all those diseases and problems that could come up. But I didn't hear about any outbreaks in animal shelters except that you had a vague assertion about them. I think you could use an illustration to show that this is a real issue and not just an imaginary issue. I thought it was nicely presented. You did a good job talking to the audience. Like I said, I'm not sure how much controversy there is on whether or not people should be better trained. The controversy might have to do with why they're not better trained, and that may be financial issues or administrative procedures or those kinds of things. All right, thank you.